Well, thank you so much to both of you for joining us for this session. And we're going to focus, as I mentioned, on this concept of the just transition, which is a term you may have come across before, and it basically speaks to the point that we're going to have an energy transition, a transition away from fossil fuels, which have driven our industrialized economies for centuries, towards clean energy. And that's going to create winners and losers, as the climate crisis itself is doing the same. And the question of who are going to be the losers, what happens to them, how far they'll be supported, is really important. And among the potential losers, or at least the communities that could potentially suffer here, are communities that have historically got a lot of value from fossil fuels. So, Thomas, your city, Essen, historically did a lot of economic activity around coal. A lot of its economic work was linked in some way to that commodity. So the energy transition is potentially very disruptive. Could you talk a bit about the challenge that presents for Essen and how the city has been addressing it?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor for me, and it's a very good view here for all of us. First of all, do you know the most spoken language in the world? It's bad English, so listen to me. In its 150 years history of transformation from a cold steel city, Essen has developed into one of the greenest cities in Germany. And I'm quite confident in saying that Essen can be a role model for successful structural change for many cities in Europe and around the world. For example, after 100 years, we were able to literally give back the river Emscher to the people and to the region in the original condition, following one of the largest European watercourse restoration projects on record. The ability of the people in Essen to adapt the new circumstances is the key to the success for the transformation progress. The project in Essen was also possible thanks to European funding, which is used efficiently. We had the opportunity to showcase the city's successful transformation in 2017. This was the year when Essen bore the title European Green Capital, and also able to show citizens and many guests from all over Germany and abroad the successful structural transformation in many areas in the city. Let me introduce my city. We have a population among 600,000. City Essen is the 10th largest city in Germany. It's located in the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia, middle in the Ruhr metropolis, as known as Ruhr area, the Rust Belt of Germany, where about 5.1 million people live. The recent history was dominated by coal and steel, massive coal mine from the early 19th century, and subsequent heavy industries displaced the rural landscape, especially in the northern part of the city. Today, the former colliery sulfur iron is an industrial monument as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as it has been since 2001, and a landscape for the city. The former colliery site has developed into a center of Essen-created industries, and it is a popular venue for events and museum industry. The changes of the city has mastered. After the decline of the coal and steel industry, Essen developed into a science business metropolis in the second half of the 20th century. And we do this with the people. This is very important. Not without the people, we deal with the people and the local and small and medium companies. And we do this in networking, especially in international networking like this. And we have a clear plan, a sustainable climate and action plan with targets, and we have to control it. This is the reason why we get the title European Green Capital. But to be a green capital is not only for a year. If you are the green capital, you are the green capital forever. So you have the job on each year. You have to control your success, and you have to show where you felt. So this is first it starts with the mindset of the people and of the government. How is the body language in the city? And at the national level, you can talk about problems. At the local level, you have to solve problems, and this is the way we do it. So I'm very glad to be here, and maybe I have you show a small picture of a city of Essen and the transformation we did.
Thank you. It's a really, really interesting case study, and I've seen similar things. For example, I went to Australia, visiting coal communities in Queensland and Victoria. In Saudi Arabia, I saw an entire nation.
We can cut a long story short. The transformation story in Essen is from grey to green.
Yeah, and it's something which so many places around the world are going to have to do. So, François, as well as your work as an author on the IPCC, you work at Sciences Po, you're the director of the Hugo Observatory, and you're looking in particular at the intersection of climate change, I believe, and migration and politics, and these really thorny questions that we're trying to grapple with here today. If I could just, first of all, ask you, what would a just transition look like to you?
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for the question. Obviously, we realize right now that most of the policies that we design and implement actually are often designed by the wealthy for the wealthy. And this is true in our own industrialized societies. This is also true, of course, in even more on a worldwide scale. And I think the problem very often is that we focus mostly on our own emissions. When you look at what governments are doing, when you look at the international negotiations, I am always struck with the fact that most governments are mostly concerned about reducing their own emissions. I was this morning at the General Assembly of Total Energy. I was not inside, I was outside with the protesters. And of course, one of the key reasons for protest was this new pipeline that Total Energy wants to set up in Uganda called EACOP. It turns out that 1 month ago, I was in Kampala, and I was discussing with Ugandan government officials, and they were saying, basically, what are we expected to do? The gross value of the crude oil that is just lying beneath us represents about 15 times the annual GDP of the country, which is still one of the poorest countries in the world. And we are being told by industrialized countries that we shouldn't touch it because this will lead the whole world into disaster. But what do they have to offer us instead of protest and indignation? The problem is that right now, the level of investment for the green transition in countries of the global south remain dramatically insufficient. And as long as there is no massive technology transfer, as long as there is no massive investment for countries in the global south into renewable energies, they will have no other choice than, of course, to exploit the fossil fuels that lie beneath them. And so, to me, a just transition would be first and foremost that we look beyond our borders and that we are not just concerned with reducing our own emissions, but that we are also concerned with reducing emissions on a worldwide scale amongst all sectors of society. And the problem right now within our industrialized societies is that most of the people who belong to the lower classes, the lower economic classes of society, feel that this transition is against them, and that they are being felt guilty because of some of the policies that are implemented in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that the key priority, and this is true at the city level and at the national level, is to show people that it's also in their best interest to do so. we cannot count only on the values of the people to do so. We need to show everyone that it is in their best interest. And we need to realize that there is at the core of this an element of social justice and also racial justice, if we consider the North-South relationship, that is extremely important. And if we fail to do that, we will never succeed, I believe.
I think it's interesting, if you look at the US and the UK, where over the last 40 years, the incomes of the top 10% have gone like this, and the incomes of the top 1% have gone like this, and the incomes of the bottom 50% have gone like this. And so a lot of people, lower income communities, in the US and UK in particular, but I think in other industrialized countries too, think, okay, for the last 40 years, everything's been done in a way that has resulted in the richest getting richer while the poor, their income stagnates. And we are now going to go through a major transition in the history of human civilization. The last 200-300 years has been the fossil fuel age, and we are now coming into the post-fossil fuel age. And the fossil fuel age has been by far the most transformational in human history. This is a major thing in human history that we're going through. And the question of who will get the benefits and who will suffer the pain, if we're not careful, it could be that the richest manage to capture the benefits and the poorest
and as a matter of fact, it is not in their best interest. I think one of the key lessons that we can take from the latest report from the IPCC, and I don't want to speak pro domo here, but is a relationship between vulnerabilities and inequalities. We know that climate impacts will exacerbate inequalities within a society. But what we also need to know is that a society that is deeply unequal is also more vulnerable as a whole to the impacts of climate change. Therefore, if we do not articulate social policies fighting inequalities with climate policies, there is a real risk that we will enter a negative spiral where more climate impacts will induce more inequalities, which in turn will induce more vulnerabilities. And the reason for this is that a major factor for the resilience of a city or of a community is the social cohesion between people, between individuals. And therefore, if there is a lack of social cohesion, it's the society as a whole that is more vulnerable and not just the poorest. Therefore, reducing inequalities is also in the best interest of the wealthy, not just in the interest of the poor. And I think this is a fundamental point as we now slowly turn towards adaptation policies. I mean, this is a big debate in France right now. The region of Essen was badly hit 2 years ago by terrible floods. And therefore, obviously, adaptation is also a key challenge in our societies. And there is a real risk that if we do not pay attention, the adaptation policies that we will design and implement will benefit the wealthiest first. And that would be a tragedy, not just for the poor, but for society as a whole.
Thomas, could you tell us how this has played out in Essen? This transformation that has happened in the city, it must have been disruptive for some people. There must have been some people who lost their jobs. Have they been able to find new jobs? And do the poorer people in Essen feel that this has worked for them?
Let me point one thing out. The mission of a mayor is to build a livable city and the social cohesion. So in this way, climate protection is one key for a better future to do this under these circumstances and to protect the planet. So on the other hand, the people in the cities and all over the world focuses crisis, climate crisis, refugee crisis, the war in Ukraine, energy crisis, and so on. And some of the people are really afraid of the future. So by now, the job we have to do together is a good communicate, to show a big picture, not only the small one. You have to show the big picture, what will be happen if we do the right thing and what we will do if we don't do the right thing. So the communication is the measure key in this time, and it's very important to reach the head and the heart of the people even for the transformation of the city in a good way, to create new jobs, green jobs, but to help the people to understand why is it necessary and why we do so. We have to explain our acting, especially for the climate protection.
And it's not just the best way to do it, but it's the only way to do it, isn't it? In a democratic country, you simply can't push through an aggressive green transition unless it has popular support.
Sure. And you have to act with the people. They have to participate the transformation. And there's a good reason why we did it in the Green Capital 2017 with projects with the people, local groups to protect their own neighborhood and so on in this way. So I think there are good ways in all the cities, but we have to enforce them and we have to talk about that.
François, you mentioned the ECOP and the position of some people in Uganda that, look, this is, we need to develop, we need to get new sources of revenue. I previously worked in India where, as you probably know, the aviation market in India is booming. There are many, many thousands, if not millions of people every year who are flying for the first time. And that is a risk for the climate. That is pushing up emissions. But for those people who are now for the first time, they can afford to fly, this is a wonderful thing for them. And if you turn around and say, well, we in Europe who have been flying for decades have decided that you shouldn't do that, that would not go down well in India. So obviously, the only answer to this, really, you can't tell developing countries that they can't develop, but we need to try to avoid additional emissions globally. So the obvious solution is there needs to be what you identified before, more financing for clean energy solutions in the developing world, but that money is not appearing in large enough quantities.
Clearly not. Because we are mostly interested in funding ourselves than funding the others. And we are fundamentally selfish when it comes to that. And we need to accept, at some point, if we consider social justice, we need to accept that one of the reasons why we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions is also to allow others to potentially increase their own emissions. And of course, that is a very hard take for us. That is the case when it comes to flying. One of the reasons why we need to fly less is that some other people who have never flown once in their life can then potentially do so once in their life. We often say that the global carbon budget is incompatible with any new extraction of oil, gas. Fair enough, but we never consider the possibility of closing down some of our plants. And this is where, Lord Mayor, I want to ask you also a question. I was born not far from Essen. I was born in Liège, Lüttich, which has known a fate pretty similar to Essen. We made a lot of wealth in coal and steel. Essen is now green, Liège is still gray. But one of the reasons also why you've been able to do so in Essen is because you're a major shareholder of RWE. The headquarters of RWE is in Essen. The city of Essen owns about 3% of the shares of RWE, and RWE is still one of the leading polluting companies in Europe. So my question to you is, what do you do as a shareholder? How can you push for RWE to invest beyond North Rhine-Westphalia, beyond Germany, and beyond Europe? What can you do as a shareholder to make sure that they decrease their investments in coal and increase their investments in renewable energies?
Yeah, that's right. And the RWE is going green. Is the third biggest producer of green energy in US by now, is growing green in UK. And this is a transformation to keep the jobs and the transformation. And yes, we have to enforce it.
It's also the company opening the new Lützenrath coal mine. The Lützenrath coal mine was also operated by RWE.
Sure, but there's a plan to close with the government.
And what is your position as a shareholder? How do you vote in the General Assembly meetings?
What?
How do you vote? What are your actions as a shareholder to try and make sure that RWE follows that path rather than investing in more coal?
No, we enforce the green plan. That's our mission.
Can I ask, Thomas, just to follow up on one point that François made there, about the support that would be needed for the kind of solutions that we're talking about for more financial support to go from rich countries like Germany to developing countries like India, for example, to enable them to go greener. And potentially, even as François said, their emissions might keep going up. Probably the single biggest objection I hear in the UK to green actions is, what's the point when China is still burning all this coal in their power stations and China isn't? Always, that's the argument given. What do you think, from the political point of view, can be done to get popular support for that kind of assistance to help developing countries develop sustainably?
Yeah, especially in the municipalities. We have cooperation projects with cities in this area to show, and there's no way for us to think, okay, we reduce the CO2 emission since the last 30 years in 30%, and otherwise in China it's growing up in 300%. So it's no case that we think, okay, we can do nothing, we're waiting for China. No, we are waiting not for China. We are trying to be a role model to go the green way in the cities with social cohesion and with acceptance by the people. And if we do it well, other cities in other parts of the world can go the same way, like Essen, for example.
Thank you so much. There's so much more to discuss, but I'm afraid we are out of time and we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much to all the panelists, and thank you everyone for listening.